Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Clint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Have you ever wondered how top teams expand across borders without losing their culture or their people? At the 2025 People Synergy Summit, we asked this question. We had a panel that consisted of leaders from GP, HSP Group, and Bose Professional to unpack how global teams grow, integrate, and thrive, even through complex mergers and acquisitions. Hi, everyone. I'm Clint Kendrick, and this is Master Your Merger, the podcast where we explore the people side of how M&A leaders turn deals into lasting success. In this episode, we're bringing you inside one of my favorite sessions from the Fall 2025 People Synergy Summit, Worldwide and Winning, How Top Teams Scale Across Borders. You're going to hear real-world lessons on global expansion, from when to use an employer of record to how to stay compliant while moving fast, to what most companies overlook after the deal closes. A huge thank you to GP for sponsoring this session and helping to make the summit possible, and to our incredible panelists for sharing their insights. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss a new connection. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, follow the Master Your Merger podcast for more people-first M&A stories and practical insights. Okay, let's get started with Worldwide and Winning, How Top Teams Scale Across Borders. So I'd like to welcome up to the stage the folks that are here for this session, so come on up. We have Bo O'Connell with GP, Michelle Musari with HSP Group, Michelle Keith with Bose Professional, Nico Davos also with GP.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be moderating this, our first session, or I guess second session of the day, Worldwide and Winning. We've got a great panel. Let's talk about global expansion, use cases, and other aspects. Joining me up here, we have Nico Davos from Globalization Partners, or GP. He's our in-house expert on all things EOR and GP related. We have Michelle Keith in the middle, who's with the Bose Corporation. I'm sure many of you know them, the music speaker and a few other things I believe they do. And then Michelle Musari from HSP. They help set up entities and advise on global expansion as well. To kick things off, I'll start with Nico. In basic terms, what is an EOR and when should companies, folks involved in global expansion think about an EOR?
Thanks, Paul. So an EOR is an employer of record. We enable our customers to hire employees all over the globe, leveraging our entities, and we assign that work 100% back to our customers. So the employees, I like to say, they still walk and talk like our customers. They can still represent them on LinkedIn, business cards, resume. Ultimately, we try to disrupt their day-to-day as little as possible. Our customers make the hiring decisions, any kind of termination decisions, compensation packages. There are cases that we may provide guidance on that, but ultimately we would defer to them on those instances.
What are some situations where an EOR might not be a fit?
So in certain situations, it would all depend on the business and the business needs. Sometimes headcount may vary. If we're talking about many hundreds or thousands, it may make sense to set up your own entity. There's other situations where if a role requires intense physical labor, that may not be the best fit for an EOR. I've seen certain situations where certain industries and regulations require specific licenses, such as aviation, things like that, where direct employment would be the better route. Those are some of those situations where you would seek other alternatives from an EOR.
Thanks, Nico. And I'm going to go with Michelle M. In this case, it's going to be Michelle M. Building on that, when companies don't use an EOR solution like GP provides, what are their choices? Maybe talk through legal entity setup versus saying asset light and how taxable presence might come into play.
Yeah, so one of the biggest factors, especially when expanding internationally as a result of an M&A activity, And the reason why first the lawyers may chime in about whether you need an entity, don't need an entity would be about this taxable presence. So this concept of permanent establishment. And the threshold to hit permanent establishment varies wildly by country, by region, and even the situation. And Nico said there could also be scenarios where, whether it's because you're in life sciences or healthcare, there's certain business licenses that you'll require. And as a result of needing the business license, at that point, it's going to be important for you to have a legal entity because the government in that particular country is going to want to tax you and make some revenue off of that. And you have the regulatory aspect that may dictate what your future operating model in each country may look like. And then you also may have a situation where, from a employee experience perspective, that there may be a desire to set up a legal entity or not. And whether that's going to be a rep office, a branch, or a subsidiary, usually your tax advisors will probably be the ones that start to advise on what that should look like to make sure that this is going to be a tax efficient structure.
And just as a follow-up to that, Michelle, are there certain countries, you don't necessarily need to specify them, that are more challenging than others in terms of?
Oh, yes, definitely. So glad you asked. Yeah, so you have some countries, for example, China, the UAE, where it could take anywhere, even approximately 9 months to get an entity set up. And a lot of the reasons that make that challenging is because there's a list of activities that you have to do that are included in the entity incorporation. And so you have countries where, China, Japan, where you have to have not only your bank, if you use Bank of America, HSBC, Citibank, you may have to have a local, so China, Japan, you have to have a local bank in that country to make the statutory payments. And so the amount of time and the relationships that you have to have built in that country to get that done so that your share capital injection can take place as part of the incorporation process. China also, you have to have an office lease ready as part of the incorporation process. When you think about a country like the UAE, you have mainland, you have free trade zone. Which place is your company going to be set up in, or where are your employees based? Making sure that you understand the factors around expats. How will that impact, and how large that office has to be as a result of the number of visas that you need. So every country's local nuance is really what can make things extra fun and tricky as it relates to getting set up internationally, which is why in a lot of cases where you can do employer of record, it can be a really nice tool to help reduce time, simplify. And so what we see a lot, especially with these M&A integrations, when there's many countries involved, is often a mixed model. And taking that time initially to really figure out the global strategy and saying, which countries am I going to have employees on an employer record? Or maybe we don't even have enough time to get an entity set up in places that take too long. And so we will start with employer of record and transfer them later, which has its own list of challenges. But there's a lot of that can go either way.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Michelle K., bring this to life for us here. Obviously, Michelle and Nico have provided some great high-level commentary around challenges, opportunities that come into play. But when, your life at Bose, when you're entering a new country, whether it's M&A or new market expansion, what's your decision process for considering EOR, entity setup, other approaches that maybe we haven't touched on?
Sure. So it's obviously a very big decision for the company and need to determine benefits, costs, and the risks. A few of those things are some of the things we heard here already. How many people are we hiring? Are they going to be remote? Are we going to be opening an office? What are the activities that are being done in the country? Are we selling and generating revenue? Is it R&D? What is it that's being done in country? What are the tax obligations? Michelle talked about permanent establishment risk, which I've learned a lot about. What are the local employment laws in some countries? They really just don't even allow for EOR. And what are the long-term goals of the company? Is it dip a toe, see how it goes? Is it to hire 200 people out of the gate? At Bose Professional, which was a carve-out from Bose, when I joined shortly right after the carve-out completed, all of those decisions on what entities and subsidies and EOR countries was already decided. More recently, though, we did dip a toe into a new country, and we have an employer of record type model. But because of the very rapid growth, we thought maybe we'd have 10 people. We're now looking at 75 in just the span of less than 2 years. So now we're having those discussions about when is the right time to set up an entity and start moving away from that model.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And there is maybe a question. There is not an exact number of at what point do you consider entity setup versus the EOR. It's a moving target as far as I've seen. That's great. So we touched on a little bit of the inorganic growth. I want to shift over to the M&A side of things where, you're taking on multiple employees in multiple countries. Nico, I'll start with you. How do EORs support those type of transactions? How do they act as a bridge towards a potentially permanent solution, pre-close or post-close?
Yeah. As far as speed to solution, we have these entities set up. It allows our customers to realize that value of the M&A quicker. Benefits for us, huge. As far as benefits guidance, it's something that always comes up with the employees. We'll provide a comparison and analysis, make sure that the team members are whole post-transition. We'll provide suggestions to our customers to make sure that we're filling any gaps that may exist between their existing benefits and what we're able to offer. Ongoing HR and legal guidance is something that we would support on. And really, it's just being able to adjust to our customers' needs as far as going as quickly as needed or taking some time as well, depending on the needs and the terms of the transaction.
And Nico, just as a follow-up, at one point in time, I guess pre-close, does it make sense or when do we typically get brought in during a conversation where there's an acquisition conceptually in play?
So really, the sooner the better. We can be working in the background along with our customers, making sure that we're ready to go once that transaction closes, that we have the packages ready, the compensation, the contracts are ready for the employees to review. One thing that, we're going to want to have ready as well is resources on our side, in-country HR resources, provide kind of one-on-one consultations, group settings, if needed, by region, by country. We kind of work alongside our customers to understand the best path forward and work together with them on that transition plan.
Thanks, Nico. And Michelle M., on staying with the M&A side of things, where do buyers typically or often underestimate complexity during diligence? And also, what are common surprises that show up after the signature of a deal?
I worked really closely with Michelle Keefe's team at the Bose Professional Carve-Out, and there's one area that really can derail the deal. For some reason, it comes as a big surprise to a lot of people on the deal team. Won't come as a big surprise to people probably listening in this room, but it's around the human capital and doing that transfer work. And so there's so much information that, let's say at the beginning of a deal, if there's going to be a private equity firm, they're the ones who are really mostly involved until, let's say, the rest of the leadership has been identified and brought up to speed. And so there's so much information that the seller may have on the individual employees with regard to the terms and conditions of their employment contracts, what sort of non-insurance benefits the employees have, whether there's works councils, are there collective bargaining agreements, are there trade unions, and all of that variation by country. And how much of an impact is that going to play? Are there contractors? There are so many details that we don't know. The buyer has to make assumptions based on the research that they've done. And there's usually this point in time when finally the seller is starting to really share that information, or you have to really ask those questions to try and get as much as you can as early as possible. And then once that information is available in the data room and going through it, and it could be in other languages and the formatting could be difficult to assess, determining all of the different complexities that come up by country, by employee type, and how that's going to affect the ability to go with, let's say, the predetermined model that your attorneys, your tax advisors, the strategic partners have put together in terms of whether entities, employer of record, et cetera, and transferring these individuals. Because as many of us have experienced, you have employees based in the UK that are under 2-pay, and the amount of the 2 different meetings you have to have and how many days in between, or France, where you have the employees have 15 months to renegotiate collective bargaining agreements, and really identifying all of the different pieces that could make this take significantly longer, or could also affect the success of having the employees transfer over and avoiding any sort of litigation or challenges and disseminating that communication to the individual. So I think the major issue that we see in terms of the wrench that gets thrown in is in relation to transferring the human capital. But on the flip side, you also have to think about, you have the employees, okay, we're getting ready to transfer them. What are we transferring them into? If it's going to be an asset purchase, you have to have your structure set up. If it's going to be employer of record, you have to make sure you have the employment contracts ready to go, of course, the insurances. But if it's going to be an entity, having the entity incorporated, being ready to have already registered with the tax authority, and making sure that we have not just entities on paper, but we have operational entities, and we have ones that are ready to do business. We have our local bank account set up. We're registered for VAT, corporate income tax, et cetera. You have locations like Brazil where you have federal, state, and municipal tax registrations. And in Brazil, there's over 5,500 different municipalities. And trying to wrap your head around all the different tax requirements is pretty hard. Making sure that the client, the buyer, is ready with local expertise on the ground, on the financial side, on the employee side, and also on the legal side is really important.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think you touched on it on the answer. One of the questions we had in here was, obviously there's a ton of legal aspects to everything that goes on in terms of employment and expansion. Where is the cutoff between what HSP or GP might provide in terms of legal advice or expertise versus like outside counsel?
So usually it's the outside counsel who is going to be providing the advice and say, okay, here's the setup that we should have. We should have a subsidiary. We should have a branch, or employer of record is going to be a good model. And they're going to be also supporting a lot on the regulatory pieces and making sure that the client understands which business licenses they're required to have. What we find, which is always a surprise to the buyer, is they think that their attorneys are doing the entity incorporation and that they'll be ready to go. But there's a distinction between incorporating the entity and operationalizing it. And you have this surprise where the lawyers set up the entity, it's ready on paper, but you can't actually do business because you can't pay your vendors, you can't make any payments because you don't have a bank account, you're not registered with the tax authorities. And many of those also, of course, the payroll registrations and the human relations registrations that'll have to get done, pension, et cetera, certainly are not ready. So it's the lawyers who are doing much more in the due diligence process. When it comes to that post-acquisition integration, that's really where you'd have outside support.
That's great. And I literally had that call yesterday with one of the firms we're potentially supporting on, and it was who's doing this and who's doing that. So it's interesting. Let's jump over back to Michelle K. You've obviously been through this. So you touched on it earlier. Tell us about a deal story where something popped up after close and how you navigated that challenge.
During our carve out, we had so many countries, we transitioned them in different phases. One of the things that challenged us both in the EOR scenario and in the non-EOR scenario was in Europe, many of the countries had car leases for their employees. And in the EOR situation, not many EORs, or at least up until that point, they're like, sorry, we don't do car leases. You have to move to a car allowance. The employees were not accepting that. And as part of the transfer agreements, the communications that had happened with the employees, they were told it was going to be a like for like transfer, so they weren't going to lose any benefits. We were at their mercy a bit, if you will. And so outside of the EOR scenario, specifically to car leases, we were a new company. We didn't have any financial history. We couldn't go through the KYC process. So nobody wanted to work with us. They wanted to work with Bose Corporate, which is not who we were. And so it took a lot of help and patience, which is not really my thing. And we had to come up with creative solutions. In the EOR scenario, we ended up going with multiple EORs across the different countries because of the different needs of each of the specific countries. We did, in fact, find an EOR provider that would help us out with the car leases. And then we had to go with not your standard car leasing situations for a lot of the other countries. We were marked up quite a bit until we could prove we could pay our bills on time, until we could get a year of financials behind us. We did long-term rentals. We worked with companies that did expat leasing of cars. So we really had to think outside of the box for those types of things.
Okay. Thanks, Michelle. So we've talked a lot about legal challenges and the overall process, but maybe we'll just shift over to the focus, the people side of things. Obviously, that's what we're dealing with in terms of bringing on employees. In many countries, they actually, based on some of the things you guys have already touched on, they hold a lot of power actually over the success of a deal getting done or not. And we've certainly seen a few on the GP side where that's played out. The way employees are handled impacts obviously valuation, retention, and brand reputation. Start with Nico and maybe Michelle, you could touch on this as well. Give us kind of your employee care checklist. What are the things that either from an EOR perspective or entity setup that folks should be considering that's most important to address all those concerns?
Yeah. And I think, honestly, to piggyback off Michelle, it's a big point for us is getting those packages right. So the existing employee contracts, we want to make sure that we can match those, the terms, the conditions, any kind of special benefits that they may have, such as a car allowance or another type of kind of unique benefit. We're going to want to make sure that we're able to match those. As far as the employee care checklist as well, each employee will be designated a local onboarding lead, local in that country, able to speak the language, able to address questions as it relates to the contracts, the benefits. Another piece that we found success with as far as helping with change is we'll host town halls, whether they're on a regional or by country basis. Ultimately, we want to set expectations. We want to address employee questions and make sure that they're comfortable with the change and the high level aspects of next.
Excuse me. Totally agree with what Nico said. As part of that employee care checklist, a lot of the things that we hear, which can be a challenge when it comes to employer of record, is transferring the original date of service and maintaining seniority. So we're doing a deal right now where we have one employee in Greece who's been at the company from which he's being acquired since 1985. And transferring that individual, maintaining his original date of service is very important to him. There's countries, especially across Europe, where having worked at a firm for a longer period of time, you get a better rate on a mortgage or from the bank for your house. And there's a lot of really important implications of maintaining that. And that can be very difficult. Obviously, we talked about benefits, but there's another piece of this that becomes very challenging, which is the communication to the employees and how that gets done. You have countries like Germany where the employees through a works council have co-determination rights, and they could literally just put their hands up and say, no, we're out, if they don't like what's being presented to them. And really appreciating the cultural nuances in each country and considering how that gets communicated to them, by whom, in what language, and at the right points in time is something that we see as being really, really critical to ensure both a successful and a compliant transfer. I would say 5 years ago, if you had asked me whether if anyone was thinking about an employee care checklist, I probably would have laughed. But in the last year since COVID, a lot of the acquisitions that we see, the employees make up such an important part of the valuation. And so making sure that they're going to say yes and they're going to come over and stay is really more important now than ever from the emphasis that we've seen.
It's a really interesting dynamic. We obviously have leadership in terms of getting a deal done, but ultimately you need to get the employees bought in as well. And I think you touched on communication being a key part of that. Michelle Kay, in terms of specific to Post Professional, maybe you could share one communication or a couple strategies, one communication strategy, one retention tactic that made a difference in terms of keeping the employees pleased with the transition.
So we tried to be as transparent as we could and as we were able to be. And although I felt that we were being very thoughtful in how we were trying to do things, I'm not sure that the employees that were impacted felt that. And I did find that getting kind of management support from the top down, even from their local managers that could speak to them in their local languages. I don't speak French, Italian, German, none of those things. So they didn't have that connection with me that they're going to have with somebody that they've worked with for a long time, who they trust, who speaks their language. And so I found over some time making sure that we had the buy-in of the local managers, that they could help us to make sure that the employees understood we were trying to do the best that we could for those employees.
Thank you, Michelle. A lot of this sounds like there's a ton of work, there's a ton of expertise involved, which typically leads to cost and expense. In some cases, why not just wait till after a deal closes to bring in experts in a situation? And that's for anyone on the panel.
So not surprisingly, but waiting until the deal closes would be very risky because everything has to be set up. If you said wait till deal signs, I'd say that's risky, but you could get it done depending on how much time you have and which countries are involved and how many employees there are. But by the time the deal closes, presuming that there is not a TSA, or depending on what the TSA might cover, where the seller is still taking care of a lot of the back office activities, you have to have a lot of things in place. You have to already have requested a lot of the information that you need. For the employees to start working, there's countries where you have to have, let's say, 12 months of their old payroll history. You have to already have spoken to a lot of the partners or your internal teams around the world who are going to be doing the back office activities that need to be ready day one, because you need to know what they already should have received from the deal team or from those involved in the employee transfer to be set up and ready. In each country, of course, you have different HR documentation. You have handbooks, you have policies, you may have sexual harassment training that has to take place. And having expertise already during, let's say, between deal sign and deal close, or ideally even earlier than that, to really map out by country. Here are all of the local requirements. Here is how much time it takes to get each of these activities done. Here are the dependencies. So in order to do this, you have to have already done this list of 12 things. And here's all the documentation that you'll need in order to perform and complete that particular task. So that project planning is so critical to being ready for deal close, for that readout, and ensuring that your entities are operational, your employees have their locally compliant employment contracts, they have all their HR documentation, you're ready with whether it's an interim regional HR admin solution until you can hire somebody to do that work, and being ready to do your taxes, do your accounting and local GAAP, keeping your entities in good standing, making sure that you have your business licenses that are approved by the regulators, which we did a deal recently where one of the business licenses they got quickly. One product is a new product that they're bringing to Europe, and it's supposed to be another 15 months until they'll get that business license. And the regulators are constantly checking in to see, okay, do you have your certificate of good standing? Is your legal entity compliant? Are you filing your taxes? These things help the regulators make a positive decision on that business license. So there is a lot of pre-work and a lot of research and requests that have to come through. So that's definitely contributes to starting early.
And maybe Michelle, Kay, were there one or two things that you thought about post-close in hindsight that you would have said we should have gotten on top of this in advance, whether it be something specific to EOR or otherwise, just in terms of the transaction and how to bring that forward in future acquisitions?
I think it's mostly just the employee information. Could we have gotten payroll records or pay statements earlier? We should have asked more questions around what non-statutory benefits were being provided to the employees. Even something as simple as Bose Corporation was offering, I think it was like a 50% discount. And when they were transferring over to Bose Professional, that discount was much lower or didn't exist in some countries. And so some of these works councils or CBAs, they actually required us to provide an allowance to people on an annual basis. Even though we're not selling those products as Bose Professional, we still had to provide compensation. They wouldn't have access to that higher discount that they had before.
The whole product that they're not actually
Yeah, the things would be, I think, it's a learning experience. And next time I'm going to be asking different questions to try to navigate that.
Perfect. And Nico, how about you on your end from a GP perspective? Like, what are the key things that we love to have early to make the transition go as smoothly as possible?
And it's really just echoing what the Michelles have said. It's uncovering every stone. We want to make sure that we have a full understanding of what the employees are currently getting so that they're happy with what we're able to offer. I thought seniority was a great point. That's a pain point that we often see with team members. Obviously, any kind of visa support that would be needed, that's a big one that we want to get out ahead of. And it's really just making sure that the employees are clear on every step of the way. There's constant touch points, engagement, and that we're addressing any kind of questions that they have along the way.
Great. Thanks, Nico. We'll jump over to diligence checklist. I'm sure there's a bunch of people in this audience who are doing due diligence. What are the top questions or documents to request early, which may be a little bit of a follow-up of the last question, but.
Yeah, so I think we've touched upon a lot of this. It's the existing employee contracts, if possible. Otherwise, it's census data for the employees, where they work, what kind of work, job description type details. It's the seniority, the tenure dates. That's a key critical piece. The visa aspects, as I mentioned. I'm not sure, did anyone have anything additional to add on those?
Totally agree. On the employee side, maybe just to talk about the entity side, right? So getting ready to catch those conveying employees. There's a lot of information that's needed to get an entity incorporated and also get a bank account, a local bank account set up, which is a lot more work than usually people are expecting as it relates to AML, KYC. And so one of the things we always try and set this expectation up as early as possible is that we need the buyer to start to already put together their future org structure chart. Who's in what location? What are the UBOs who are the UBOs? And also who are the signatories? Because as part of getting entities incorporated, getting your memorandums, articles of association, and the bank account set up, there's so many forms that are going to be coming fast and furious and wet signatures, and it could be multiple copies in different countries. And if you there's some banks like JP Morgan where, yes, it's the same name globally, but their banks aren't really interconnected. And so it's not like they're sharing documents. So you have to reprint and re-sign. And so already knowing really early on who that signatory is, making sure that you have their utility bill, their passport copy, and those documents is really important to have early on.
No, for us, it would be benefits, compensation from the employee piece.
Okay, going to go off script here a little bit. I guess, Michelle Kay, you mentioned you either worked with or looked at a number of different EOR providers. I mean, what were the considerations or concerns that you had as you looked at each of them in terms of whether it be price, coverage area, like what were the different things that you saw from the different providers?
So definitely cost is definitely a big piece. What could be provided to the employees from a benefits perspective, the flexibility that the EORs have to be able to support the employees. We have worked initially with one EOR that was very rigid, which would be great if we had somebody new that was starting, but transferring somebody who's been with a company, an established company like Bose for 30 plus years, there was no flexibility, right? So how flexible can we be to support the employees and the needs that they have? And then, of course, like I mentioned, for us, the biggest pain point was the car leases and company credit cards, all things that are expected in a sales organization in Europe, but in not as common in the EOR world.
And Nico, I guess maybe quickly just touch on the cost. What is the cost model for GP in terms of the EOR model?
Sometimes there's, I would say it's on a per month basis as far as that would go. And it's in some cases, particularly around M&As, there's sometimes setup costs associated. This just has to do with all the legwork that we do as far as working towards a successful achievement post-launch, and then ongoing HR support, employment infrastructure, the ability to hire moving forward. Like you said, I think transferring over employees is a different monster. The new hire piece is a little bit of a less resistance on kind of hiring.
And Michelle, I know you touched on a lot of things that HSP does in terms of this. You guys, from a cost model perspective, how do you guys operate?
Yeah, so a lot of it is fixed fees, right? So if you're filing taxes every month or quarterly, depending on the threshold of your revenue, you have fees that happen, whether it's once a month, once a year, because the activity takes place at that period of time. Usually you'll have a one-time setup fee, and then you'll have monthly or annual recurring fees. Same as what GP has said is the employee transfer. I have tried many times to convince the powers that be to make things into fixed fees, and it's very difficult because, as everyone here knows, there's so much that you don't know. There's so much that the buyer does, your client doesn't even know yet, or you yourselves don't know because you don't have the information from the seller. And so that transferring of the individuals from the seller to the buyer, all the due diligence activities that have to take place, the analysis between what they had before, keeping them whole, what to offer them, remediation, that, is, unfortunately, it is hourly work, time and material, because there's a way to anticipate and project what the expectations are, but there are so many surprises that will come up that really the only honest way to price it is to give expectations and then try to work around how much time it takes to get it done.
That's great. And just to go back to what we talked about earlier, what are some countries that actually are very not easy to work with, but what are the popular countries where employees are looking to get stood up, maybe both from an acquisition, but maybe more so from a new market entry?
The UK can be quite straightforward. It also helps that it's in the same language. It's a very quick incorporation process. However, the employee transfer piece takes longer because you have two pay laws. You have the Netherlands, which is also a bit shorter. There are a lot of countries also in Latin America that can be faster to get set up and transfer the employees. I think the harder piece of it is really about how many different types of employee benefit offerings are there, how much is there to go through. But there are definitely countries that are much more streamlined when it comes to getting the entity set up. But then you have to look at, okay, is the employee transfer piece, is that still overly complex?
And Michelle Kay, have there been any countries you've looked at that you said, this is overly complex and we're not ready to move into this market?
So since the transfer that I'm aware of, it's really only been the one country that we're working in now, and it's been working out well. We had more than our share of challenges, I think, during the actual transfer. But since then, it's just been the one additional country where we're getting into.
How can an EOR mitigate the rampant increases to premiums as we've seen in the past several years? Do you have any thoughts on how EORs can help with that versus a company trying to handle this on their own?
So it's a great question. As far as benefits administration and management, it's not exactly my wheelhouse. I do know our teams are evaluating costs on every 6 months. We're always trying to get the most beneficial terms and offerings and most scalable offerings for our customers. We're also, in cases where there's the need for a bespoke or customized package, I know we're also trying to do the best that we can on behalf of our customers and try to be as flexible as possible.
And in the room, we have a question here from Nathan.
Yeah, thank you for the great insights today. Nathan from Microsoft. One thing that I've encountered that I found quite odd, and I'm curious if this is a common pattern, is where we've acquired startups that are using PEOs in certain countries, and they've been offering equity to their employees. So it became a nightmare to unwind. My question to the panel is that something you've commonly seen with tech startups or in other industries?
Take both of them. Yes, it's common. High-tech companies, fintech, it's very common for them to get equity. It's obviously a great way to lure talent to a company that could have unknown potential in the future, especially at more competitive salaries, and individuals who are based all around the world. That is a big challenge. And it's a challenge when it comes, I'm sure GP has a thought on this too, when it comes to moving them on to another employer of record, if they're already on an employer of record now, trying to figure out whether you need to do a tripartite agreement in order to compliantly get them over and make it so that you don't have to also, that becomes a really big challenge when it comes to individuals who are on an employer record, they're being acquired. And then what do? Do you pay them out? It could be severance for how much time and then rehire them. If you want to transfer them in the best way possible and using this tripartite agreement, not some companies will do it, some companies won't do it. And what is that going to cost you? So it is a challenge. Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. It's part of that due diligence, that checklist. So we have seen tripartites where we're able to have a three-party agreement. We have seen resign, rehire scenarios. We've been able to facilitate equity payments as well as sometimes we see phantom stock. We're able to facilitate the payroll as a bonus. So there are ways that we work around it, but it really depends on the specifics of the situation.
Yeah, we have another question from Jillian. Can you discuss the tax considerations for an EOR and how an EOR can help during a tax audit?
Yeah, so that responsibility would be on the EOR. So our payroll, we have local payroll teams in each country facilitating that payroll, and ultimately we'd be responsible for those filings. We'd manage the employee's payroll and kind of their tax situation. And ultimately, at any point, if any kind of documentation or anything is needed, we'd be the ones that would supply that. That's brought onto our shoulders, essentially.
Is there a standard operating procedure that you have with respect to honoring prior years of service on an EOR, and is it different from country to country?
It's a great question. So it would vary country to country. There are certain countries that were unable to recognize seniority. China is a country that's difficult in that case. France, there's some difficulties in that case. I don't know the exact percentage, but in most countries, we're able to honor the seniority. We're able to carry that over. We're able to bring over time off days, things like that, vacation accruals. But there are some countries that we have to have kind of workarounds and bespoke plans. But it's an outstanding question. It is evaluated country to country.
No more questions online? Okay. A big thank you, Bo, Nico, Michelle, and Michelle.